Hi everybody, welcome to my channel. I'm so grateful for all the attention lately, all the support, all the validation. Today I want to talk about hashtag mental health. Who else has been having a bad time with hashtag mental health lately? Here are some tips for all of you, but before I get into it, remember to smash the like button, reshare button, retweet button, restory button, subscribe button, donate button. Just do whatever you can to make me the #1 most looked at, most listened to content creator online ever. Thank you. Okay, babes, tip #1, remember that you are valid. Tip #2, yes, you are being gaslighted. Tip #3, your truth is the only truth. Tip #4, consume my content. Consume my content. Consume my content. Okay. All right. Hi. Welcome back to It's Not Just in Your Head, a podcast about how capitalism is bad for your mental health by an actual therapist, me, Max Golding, LMFT, and Harriet Fraud, PhD, and stuff. Harriet's actually not going to be in this podcast today because when I pitched the idea of us having a sort of critique and commentary and discussion about the social media world of mental health and therapy and such, she just said she's too out of the loop. She's not on social media. She doesn't follow it. She doesn't understand it. I myself am a millennial, so I understand it. I grew up inside the internet. So that's what you are going to listen to me talk to myself about today. With a little bit of overproduction and fun, just because when it's solo I can do that. Consume my content. Consume my content. What caught my attention initially on this was actually the woke CIA ad by the Latina woman who was doing this weird sort of spoken word piece about like why she joined the CIA, and she comes from this like oppressed background and everything. And then she like mentioned her DSM-5, like mental disorder diagnosis, which was generalized anxiety disorder, which by the way, like basically everybody has. Like it's a really weird thing to throw in there, but of course the CIA is like trying to be as relatable as possible to millennials. So here's a clip of that.
I am perfectly made. I can wax eloquent on complex legal issues in English while also belting Guayaquil de mis amores in Spanish. I can change a diaper with one hand and console a crying toddler with the other. I am a woman of color. I am a mom. I am a cisgender millennial who's been diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder.
Do you meet criteria for generalized anxiety disorder? Talk to your psychiatrist today about joining the CIA. The CIA is pretty smart. I mean, the I in CIA stands for intelligence. So they must have known. They did their anthropological research on the population they're targeting, which is millennials. They knew that having her share that would be relatable to at least some people. So it signaled to me that there's a lot more of a widespread usage of DSM language and mainstream medical model psychology jargon within my generation than I had realized. Around the same time that this ad came out, my partner and I were with a couple of friends who are in their early 20s, and they were talking amongst themselves, and we overheard them use phrases like intergenerational trauma. I don't know, maybe it was epigenetics. There was anxious avoidant attachment. There were DSM, maybe like borderline or narcissism was used. So I asked her later, I mean, yeah, do you know what's up with that? You know, these kids, man. And she's like, yeah, it's Instagram therapy. I was like, what do you mean? Yeah, Instagram therapy. Like there's just every 20-year-old sort of thinks they're a therapist now. Like there's all these posts. It's a trending thing. It's trending. I was like, okay, that's weird because I'm not on social media anymore. So I went to TikTok and Instagram and I started typing in hashtags like mental health and therapy and Instagram therapy and TikTok therapy, and I found what the kids are talking about. And I did a little bit of anthropology myself. The CIA is not the only one that can do research on populations.
Did you know that these are signs that you may have been emotionally neglected by your parents? Part 3. You have low self-esteem or poor self-image. You are very sensitive to any type of rejection. You believe you are fundamentally flawed and there's something about you that's wrong, even though you can't name what it is.
So there's one very popular TikTok therapist. Here's another.
Quick reminder from a therapist, go where you are celebrated, not where you are tolerated. And pay attention to who's around you when you feel your best.
And also someone very popular, not a licensed therapist, but a life coach who comes up when you look up the hashtag TikTok therapy.
You know, the real reason I started all of this was to help people find a way to express themselves. To help people be able to talk about the hardest things that they've ever had to go through and find a community that can support them. And I've done that. I've helped so many thousands of people be able to really talk about the things that they have never talked about.
So there you have it. Those are 3 relatively randomly selected samples of people who are, well, accounts on TikTok, which are some of the most popular, which you can find from just looking up the hashtag TikTok therapy. By the time this episode is released, maybe there'll be other accounts or other posts that are up there, but these are ones that have like thousands of engagements or whatever. So I have a question for listeners. So why do you guys think that mental health is so heavily trending these days, and especially amongst millennials? And I'm going to answer my own question with 3 potential theories, and the theories may be like distinctly true on their own. There may be overlap between them, and maybe there's another theory or multiple theories that could be correct. So the first theory is that the millennial and Zoomer generations are simply just more conscious. They're more aware of the fact that like there's mental health stuff going on, like that there are moods and feelings and thoughts and like disordered thinking and disordered like obsessions and compulsions and anxieties and dissociation and derealization. And they just, because they're online, they've picked up the language and they're just more aware, right? So the theory 1 is like the younger generation just more aware of the reality of mental health. That's it. Theory number 2, mental health is sort of trending more amongst the younger generation because the younger generation is actually experiencing more negative mental health symptoms than any previous generation. Like boomers, they might be struggling in certain ways. Maybe there's some health problems and stuff, but the higher rates of depression, anxiety, blah, 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 is being experienced for Zoomers and millennials. And that explains it. That's theory number 2. Theory number 3, do you ever feel like life is just completely pointless? You go to work and you wonder, what the fuck am I actually doing here? Why do I even do this work? You're sitting in class and you think, this is a crock of shit. This doesn't matter. I don't know why I'm studying this in school. You look at your family and you say, I can't relate to these people. Gee, this is weird. Do you suspect your neighbors of suspecting you of doing something wrong all the time? So you rush to avoid them to get into your home. You lock the door. Do you worry that everyone hates you and is always judging you? These all may be symptoms of Karl Marx's 200-year-old theory of alienation. Is that funny? I hope this is funny. So I'm going to explain what Marx's theory of alienation was, and then I'm going to kind of circle back to the TikTok therapy stuff and Instagram therapy and all that. So Marx had a lot of ideas, and one of them was that under capitalism, for the working class in particular, or actually for everybody, including sort of the bourgeoisie, the ownership class, but in particular, the working class experienced a sense of alienation in relation to their work and what they did for work. So here's kind of what his thinking was on this. There were 4 general types of alienation. One was from the product itself that they were producing, and I'll use an example of, let's say there's somebody that works in a tire manufacturing plant. They don't really have a relationship to the tire itself. They just kind of put the plastic or rubber stuff on the metal stuff, and then they stack it somewhere, and the boss tells somebody to drive it somewhere, and then it gets put in a warehouse, and somebody else tells somebody else what to do. And the profits just go up, up, up to some owner, some set of shareholders, or whatever. Nobody really knows how it works. The worker just sits there and makes the tires, right? So how meaningfully connected are they to the tires? Really not very much, right? They may actually have generated a lot of knowledge about the tire through the process. Maybe they know something about rubber and metal that maybe you and I don't, that they've learned from this job they've been doing for a few years. But most likely they don't really give a shit. They don't have a relationship to the actual tires. They don't care. They just have to do it because it's their job, right? So there's alienation from the product itself. The second kind of alienation is from the act of production, or the work itself. And Marx was talking about a time when everybody was being kind of moved from the countryside to factories, and in these factories it was the most repetitive, mind-numbing work ever. And so imagine like how alienated from the actual labor, not just the products, but like, let's say, it's tires or I don't know, anything. You're just doing the same boring shit relentlessly over and over and over again for a pretty crappy wage. And you have no meaningful relationship to the actual work. You're feeling drained, miserable, unhappy. You go home and you're just like, think of today, you're 2021, right? Someone that works in like a restaurant, a fast food restaurant, or, I mean, even if you have like a decent tech job, like a lot of people listening right now who have like decent jobs, what we would consider, you come home and you feel drained and you're like, why do I keep doing this? I get paid good money, but I don't like it. So there's alienation from the labor itself. It feels kind of meaningless and pointless. The third type was, I really like this. The German term, I guess, I don't know how to pronounce it properly. It's Gattungswesen, I think, but it stood for species essence. And it was this really cool philosophical idea that humans just have this like essence within their species, within themselves. It's a sort of psycho-spiritual concept, but the basic way to say it is it's like alienation from the self. And Marx, I think, was kind of trying to argue that the self was this really deep thing, that it wasn't just like myself. It's like this deep, essential part of who you are, this core part of who you are. And so through this repetitive, meaningless, estranged, alienated labor that you have to engage in as a member of the working class, you're also alienated from your own sense of core self. And you're kind of, any deep sort of, any advancement toward a mode of self-actualization within your own psyche is being sort of stunted and blunted by your repetitive, pointless work that you're engaging in. And lastly, there was a kind of alienation that you experience from other workers. And part of that is that, in any given workplace, you're all sort of competing against each other. You might work on teams, like, teamwork, guys, we're all a team, we're all one big family. But for the most part, like, there's a lot of people in any given workplace who are hoping for a promotion. There's always the snitchy coworker that's going to snitch on so-and-so for doing something slowly, or they didn't like check the box correctly. And so there's if there is this sort of species essence or core, if there's anything cooperative or a sort of camaraderie that is any part of human nature for people to experience in any given workplace and just in general, under capitalism, members of the working class are going to become alienated from each other. They're not going to see each other as having mutual economic interests or just general sort of humanitarian similarities. They're going to start looking at differences and competing and kind of going after each other. There's exceptions to that, obviously. But so just to summarize, his theory of alienation was that workers are alienated from what they're producing. They're alienated from the work itself. They're alienated from themselves. They're alienated from others under capitalism. Speaking as a mental health coach who's helped trillions, I have to say, bro, that I'm not alienated from the product that I push. Because what is the product that I push? It's inspiration. It's hope. It's meaning. When people respond to my posts with comments and they say, wow, this really touched me in a way nobody's ever touched me before, that's when I know this is a real connection. This is not alienation, bro. I'm sorry. If you don't like the internet, I guess you can go live off in the woods. Communism killed 100 million people, right? So Marx's theory of alienation is just a theory, and it's almost 200 years old, and it can't explain like every single sort of mental health issue that every single young person is experiencing right now. But I like it because, I'm a Marxist weirdo, and I think that talking about how capitalism impacts things, like just having this very unequal, very unstable, very profit-driven economic system has like very obviously deep and serious impacts on our internal, emotional, relational, psychic lives. And I do find it troubling, to be honest, that basically zero of the top influencer therapists on social media are ever going to talk about something like Marx's theory of alienation or use the term neoliberalism or deindustrialization. And I know that there's a reason for that. It's because, the sort of discourse on mental health, as Harriet and I have talked about 1,000 times in this podcast, it's depoliticized, it's ahistorical, it's symptom-based, it's based on this sort of medical model or even sometimes pop psych, this very like atomized, individualized mode. And so we've had a few generations now where this has been sort of ingrained into the minds of people generally, and especially the younger generation, Because if you go online, if you're feeling crappy and you Google, like, why do I feel like shit? There's going to be like mental health crap that comes up. And then you're going to read the Wikipedia page on like complex PTSD and OCD and like, do I have autism? Do I have X? Do I have Y? Do I have Z? I'm going to read a couple passages from a book called Coming Up Short by Jennifer Silva. And it's about the way that working class adulthood for like young working class adults, like from the 20s to 30s, what it's like. She interviewed 100. Well, I'll just read the passage actually. So this section is called "The Remaking of Working Class Adulthood." In order to tell this story, I examined the transition to adulthood through the voices of 100 working class young people in their mid-20s to early 30s, from service sector workplaces like casual dining restaurants and clothing chains to community colleges and temp agencies, fire stations and army bases, and bowling alleys and movie theaters. I sought out the younger members of the working class in Lowell, Massachusetts, Richmond, Virginia, and a handful of other cities that embody the rise and fall of the American industrial working class. I spoke with blacks and whites, men and women, investigating the changing meanings, practices, and consequences of working class adulthood through the accounts of those who are living in it, or those who are living it. For the young men and women I spoke with, adulthood is not simply delayed, as much of the existing literature on the transition to adulthood would suggest. Instead, adulthood is being dramatically reimagined along lines of work, family, relationships, intimacy, gender, trust, and dignity. The majority of the young people I spoke with bounced from one unstable service job to the next, racking up credit card debt to make ends meet and fearing the day when economic shocks, an illness, a school loan coming out of deferment, will erode what little stability they have. This economic insecurity seeps into their homes, where experiences of family dissolution through divorce and premature parental death, illness and work-related disabilities, domestic violence, and constant financial stress leave them uncertain and anxious about the viability of marriage and child-rearing. Douglas, a 25-year-old black man who lives with his godmother, said wistfully, "People used to get married at 21. You don't see that anymore. Trust is gone. The way people used to love is gone." As Brandon and Diana underscore, experiences of powerlessness, confusion, and betrayal within the labor market, institutions such as education and the government, and the family teach young working-class men and women that they are completely alone, responsible for their own fates, and dependent on outside help only at their own peril. They are learning the hard way that being an adult means trusting no one but yourself. And a few paragraphs down from that, I'm going to read this passage. I think just sums up, my take on why the hashtag mental health thing is so trending these days. At its core, this emerging working-class adult self is characterized by low expectations of work, weariness toward romantic commitment, widespread distrust of social institutions, profound isolation from others, and an overriding focus on their emotions and psychic health. Rather than turn to politics to address the obstacles standing in the way of a secure adult life, the majority of the men and women I interviewed crafted deeply personal coming-of-age stories, grounding their adult identities in recovering from their painful pasts, whether addictions, childhood abuse, family trauma, or abandonment, and forging an emancipated, transformed, and adult self. As the sources of dignity and meaning of adulthood of their parents' and grandparents' generations, the daily toil of the shop floor, the making of a home and family, slipped through their fingers, the young men and women I spoke with are working hard to remake dignity and meaning out of emotional self-management and willful psychic transformation.
Quick reminder from a therapist. Quick reminder from a therapist. Quick reminder from a therapist.
So, by the way, I'm not here to take down any TikTok or Instagram therapists, but I do want to point out, I'm going to read more of Jennifer Silva's book because she talks about neoliberalism a lot as a contextual reason for why working class adults like millennials and Zoomer generation people are so into this psychological, psychic, emotional self-management talk and digging into their own individualized personal suffering experiences as their narratives about how they're becoming and struggling through adulthood, that this is very different than their parents' and grandparents' generation, in part because of specifically the neoliberal shift in economy and culture from roughly the late 1970s to 1980s. And now, I don't think most millennials understand that we're swimming in neoliberalism, like a fish doesn't know they're swimming in water. But I just would like to point out that most of the therapists you'll find who are the top sort of influencers on Instagram and TikTok, not only are they offering all this sort of, I mean, frankly, I'm sorry to say it, but it's shallow and it's almost like direct to consumer ad flavored advice and just content. It's just, it's just content, right? Like content creators. They also have links to their personal websites where they'll sell anything from like t-shirts that say some generic thing about mental health to protein bars, because since they're influencers, just like, there's influencers that will just sell like lipstick or makeup or like tennis shoes or something. These therapists have been contacted by other brands who are trying to use them as influencers. So, this is the level of normacy, maybe hyper normalcy, of the sort of self-branding, like neoliberalized self that these therapists are participating in. I don't think they have any idea that they're doing it. And I don't think they have any sort of like historical or political understanding of what they're doing, what they're swimming in, and what their clients are swimming in. They're just looking at everything from this hyper-individualized framework. So in any case, I'm going to read a little bit more of Jennifer Silva's book. And by the way, Jennifer Silva, we sent you an email. Please join us on the podcast, because I think your book actually, it was so eye-opening for me. This is so interesting. So this section is called The Decline of the Industrial Working Class. The neoliberal turn has had grave consequences for the American working class. Since 1973, the real wages of working class jobs have declined by 12% for those with a high school diploma and by 26% for those without one. 50 years ago, a third of U.S. employees worked in factories, making everything from clothing to lipstick to cars. But as the economy stagnated in the 1970s, businesses sought to move their industries to the American South or outside the U.S. altogether in search of unionless workers, meaning workers without unions, unionless workers, subsidies, and tax cuts. Today, millions of these jobs have been shifted overseas. I'm going to repeat that, millions, okay? Millions of these jobs. So that's millions of people, which means millions of families who, as millennials, grew up with their parents having their jobs outsourced. So millions of these jobs have been shifted overseas, leaving only about 1/10 of the nation's 131 million workers employed by manufacturing firms. The American working class man, such as the steelworker or the coal miner of the post-war generation, has experienced a steep decline in employment, job security, compensation, access to pensions, and employer-subsidized health insurance. His 21st century counterparts have been displaced to the service economy: cashiers, office clerks, cooks, retail workers, or customer service representatives, where they are poorly paid, vulnerable to layoffs, and much more likely to be female. In the wake of these economic and social shifts, the broadly distributed prosperity of the post-war generation has given way to soaring levels of income and wealth inequality, crippling economic insecurity, and declining social mobility. Since 1979, for example, the top 20% of earners have captured 75% of overall income gain, while the bottom 20% gained only 4%. As a result, by the year 2007, over a quarter of low-income families were making debt payments of at least 40% of their incomes. I'm going to repeat that. So for over a quarter of low-income families, that's like over a quarter of all lower-income families, 40% of their incomes was being paid back to debt, whereas for the highest income families, only 3.8% of that was being paid to debt. These economic and cultural transformations have destabilized traditional pathways to adulthood, leaving working class youth like Diana, Brandon, and Wanda, these are 3 of the 100 that she interviewed for the book, struggling to finish school, move out, get a job, or create a stable relationship. And I want to point out briefly that the TikTok therapists and Instagram therapists that people are like really idolizing, their parents probably experienced this same sort of economic destabilization process. If they're millennials, I'm 36. If any of them are in their like late 20s, early 30s, they themselves are probably sort of collective victims, not just of like family trauma and emotional neglect, but of fucking neoliberalism. But none of them are ever going to talk about it, right? So caught in the teeth of a merciless job market and lacking the community support, skills, and knowledge necessary for success, working class young adults are relinquishing the hope for a better future that is at the core of the American dream. I'm going to skip over some of those parts and then get into something that that Jennifer Silva talks about, which is a section called Coming of Age in the Mood Economy. As these examples so powerfully demonstrate, working-class young men and women are growing up in a world without solidarities and without safety nets, leaving them wary and distrustful in their interactions with others.
Alienation.
That's my addition. She didn't write Alienation. I now turn to examine how economic insecurity and social uncertainty are reshaping the ways in which working-class young people conceptualize the self, particularly as it relates to their definitions of legitimate and worthy adulthood. Insecure and alone, working-class men and women cannot point to a blue-collared uniform, a diploma on the wall, or a wedding band on their finger to mark their progress through life. Instead, it is up to them to redefine the contours of a meaningful life. In this book, I'll argue that working-class young men and women inhabit a mood economy in which legitimacy and self-worth are purchased not with traditional currencies such as work or marriage or class solidarity, but instead through the ability to organize their emotions into a narrative of self-transformation.
The ability to organize their emotions into a narrative of self-transformation.
I'm resolving my trauma, my CPTSD, my OCD, my borderline traits. I'm resolving my trauma. I'm becoming more woke. I'm becoming more conscious. I'm becoming more aware. I'm so mindful. I do a lot of yoga. Rather than live and work within institutions that call for a stoic, taciturn, deeply gendered self, this generation is learning that the self, like their jobs and relationships, must be continually remade. The need to continuously recreate one's identity, whether after a failed attempt at college or an unanticipated divorce or a sudden career change, can be an anxiety-producing endeavor. In a world of rapid change and tenuous loyalties, the language and institution of therapy and the self-transformation it promises has exploded in American culture. And then there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 references she has to that sentence. That's crazy. With 1 in 4 American adults reporting a mental health disorder in a given year. So at this point, I'm just like reading her whole book. I'm going to find one more passage by her, and then I'll continue talking, and then I'll end this solo cast. Okay, so from chapter 5, which is called Inhabiting the Mood Economy, there's one final passage I'm going to read, and it is, the section is called The Unforgiving Mood Economy. A great deal of scholarly work has critiqued the therapeutic ethos for promoting narcissism, engendering weakness, and destroying the social fabric. I feel like I sound like that a lot when I talk about therapy, which is weird as a therapist, right? Such critiques often veil a politically regressive agenda, one that yearns for a return to models of selfhood and sources of authority that would delegitimize the very selves of women, of people with alternative sexual identities, which the therapeutic narrative makes possible. As my interviews reveal, telling a therapeutic story about oneself can be both liberating and meaningful, as when Monica breaks free to love whom she chooses, or Kathleen embarks on a career to help abandoned children. As Eloise, I don't know how to say her name, Eloise explains, the therapeutic ethos appears to be a cultural resource that helps actors reach forms of well-being as they are socially and historically constructed. For working-class youth, the mood economy provides the very possibility of selfhood and self-respect in a world where suffering is plentiful and work and family unreliable. Yet, the mood economy also has a darker side, often leading young adults to draw harsh boundaries against their families, to become suspended in the narratives of suffering they believed would bring them promise, and to construe the self as their greatest risk in life. The mood economy's imperative to heal oneself leads to a new kind of symbolic boundary construction, boundaries against those who do not have the will to be healthy, happy, and strong. Candace, the young black woman introduced in Chapter 3, whose life was turned upside down by her mother's drug addiction and her father's abandonment, reported that she had suffered from depression for years. She confessed, I was just so depressed. I was just so unhappy. I was just crying all the time. Or not crying all the time, but because I held my emotions in. When she was placed in a foster home in the 12th grade, Candace got a chance to focus on her own life. So it was definitely the only time I was able to feel like a child. The first time probably since I was like 9. And then there's kind of a long passage by this person, Candace. After years of trying to help her mother, whom she describes as a fallen star, Candace explains that she finally learned to consider her own needs. By systematically dividing her life into compartments that she can and cannot control, she has superimposed cognitive order onto the structural chaos of her life. With the support of her foster family, Candace now feels empowered to leave her days of depression and hopelessness behind. While she is still angry with her father, till this day I tell them, don't tell people about me. Don't tell people I run track. Don't tell people I have a nice car. Don't tell people I went to college. Don't tell people about me. She has learned to see herself as independent from him, cutting family ties as the conduit to freedom from depression and genuine happiness. And then Silva kind of goes on with some other examples. So I guess this is kind of where I want to end. I guess I'm not saying, especially in quoting all of Silva's stuff, that I'll be clear. I'm not saying therapy's bad. I'm not saying TikTok therapy's bad and social media therapy's bad and all this like trending mental health stuff. I want to zoom out and just again like ask listeners like, why are we in this trend? And I think Silva offers some good insights. I think the very old theory of alienation under capitalism is one sort of clue. I think Silva's description of the transition from the sort of older economic mode that we were in the US to neoliberalism is one clue. And the trend that she describes of like working class adults using all this like therapeutic jargon to describe everything is a big clue. And so, you know, I guess you can decide on your own. Do you think this is good or bad? Do you think, you know, there are pros and cons? You're going to be all like dialectical about it. And I think, you know, as a therapist, I'll close on this. I was born in 1985, and so all the neoliberal stuff that happened totally impacted my family. My family was pretty economically devastated in a lot of ways because of a lot of economic policies that were being put in place during that time. And I don't think they even would really, I mean, maybe my dad, but I was going to say, I don't talk to my dad anymore. I haven't talked to him in many years, which I think it's interesting. This is apparently a trend of my generation, right? He, at some point, I think had pointed to like the printing press industry being totally collapsed by like outsourcing and automation. Like Kinko's basically got rid of like the printing press industry. And so there, you know, some of the parents, for those of us who are millennials, might have realized like a lot of their own distress as families came because of neoliberal policies. Who knows if they would use that word neoliberalism? But it is really fascinating, right? That like I myself ended up having like all these kinds of internal suffering experiences that led me to therapy, that led me to become a therapist. That I am of this exact generation that found solace in constructing selfhood out of personal suffering and therapeutic ideas and processes. And I'll share this as the last thing. My therapist, when I saw him in like my mid-20s, which was like 10 years ago, assigned me a book called Drama of the Gifted Child by, I'm totally forgetting her name, but she's a psychoanalytic object relations therapist. And it's basically about narcissistic mothers. And the reason the therapist was assigning this to me is because he was hearing in what I was narrating as my own sort of self-story and growing up and my family of origin, that I was raised by a narcissistic mother. And so I read Drama of the Gifted Child, and it totally changed the way arguably I'm a therapist now because of this book, because it spoke to me. It spoke to me about like how much I suffered in being raised by this single mom who had like just such narcissistic traits. Everything was about her. And so I was so emotionally neglected. And that TikTok therapist that's like, here are signs of if you were emotionally neglected. And so I thought, well, man, you know, this is so powerful that my life is totally transformed from seeing a therapist. Now, there are like armies now that are in psychology schools that have had really similar experiences. And I just want to point this out. My therapist never pointed out that deindustrialization and neoliberalism may have been a clue as to why my family was falling apart and that why I was so emotionally neglected and that why I might then turn later to the self-help movement, psychology, and psychotherapy as a way to solve the individual and internal sort of family problems that I'd experienced. And although my therapist never encouraged for me to set strong boundaries against my family, I did end up doing that. And it was really eye-opening in reading Silva's book to know that tons of millennials have done the same thing. They went down this road of like defining their selfhood as these atomized selves that experienced unique forms of family trauma, and then they needed to set boundaries with all these family members who just couldn't like build the strong enough will to like get over their addictions and their OCD and their complex PTSD and crap. And now we're all just kind of floating around in this weird world of social media where people are like making connections to totally random accounts of people that sell protein bars in between giving you therapeutic advice for 59 seconds on TikTok. I mean, does anyone else think that's kind of weird? And that maybe we should zoom out and look at these trends and think about it a little bit more sociologically and from like a political economy perspective, and not just from the perspective of like my suffering, my trauma, my emotional issues. Let's open up the DSM and see which diagnostic criteria I meet, right? Doesn't that make a little bit more sense? So, okay, wow, that's a lot of talking to myself. It's 35 minutes. Okay, everybody. Well, I highly recommend this book by Jennifer Silva. Hopefully we'll have her on the podcast soon. Email us if you have any reactions or thoughts or feedback on this episode. It's notjustinyourhead@gmail.com. If you want to support, smash the like button, smash the subscribe button. By the way, the main reason we do the Patreon thing is mainly to pay Liam because he does the editing and social media. Harriet and I still haven't even paid ourselves out from the, it's sitting in the bank account. Like a third of the money from Patreon, if you want to become a patron, by the way, just goes to Liam, and the rest just sits there because we haven't decided what to do with it, because neither of us actually need the money because we're therapists, and we, like I have a mid-level caseload that's comfortable economically for me, so I don't actually need the Patreon money. So for that reason, don't give us the money because you think we need the money. We don't, but it does help Liam, and it is actually like labor for sure to do the editing stuff. And if you have any suggestions of what we could use the money for, like, I don't know, like build a website, or I don't know. I really would like to challenge the mental health field more directly. Like in this episode, I didn't name names. There's going to be links to 3 of the TikTok therapists, but I would actually like to challenge therapists, like these influencer people and the field generally, to say like, look, it's not just in your head, and this whole therapeutic framework and this like like everything Silva kind of goes over, like we really need to integrate this into the mental health field to either transform or I think evolve the mental health field out of the very sort of outdated and like neoliberal mode that it's stuck in. Like it's actually, I think, really harmful. That there's almost zero therapists out there that are like, well, join a working class organization to engage in class struggle to like change the socio-political order. Maybe there are some therapists out there that encourage their clients to do that. I don't know. I tend not to with my clients, actually. It would be weird. But I think that's, again, it's because it's the neoliberal mode. It would seem out of place. I have actually brought up you should unionize your workplace kind of conversations a couple times, but it never really sticks. Okay, everybody. It's not just in your head @gmail.com and patreon.com/it's not just in your head. Thank you very much, and bye-bye.